And if we act quickly, we may still be able to stop the clock.
It's September 1983. A damp, windswept night in Aberdeen, Scotland. A 58-year-old taxi driver named George Murdoch finishes his tea, puts on his cap, and steps out into the chilly darkness. He doesn't know it yet, but in just a few hours his name will be seared into Scottish criminal history under one of the most chilling nicknames ever whispered, the Cheesewire Killer. George's final fare would not be just another passenger. It would be the beginning of a 4-decade mystery. A man in the back seat, quiet, unassuming, who suddenly struck with brutal precision, using a weapon so unusual that police would spend the next 41 years trying to understand why. And now, in 2025, investigators have announced a breakthrough. After decades of silence, they've uncovered a new DNA profile known only as Male Z. The question is, who is Male Z? And could the answer to this decades-old mystery be hiding in plain sight? Before we dive into the crime, we need to know the man. George Murdoch was not some shadowy figure living a dangerous life. He was, in fact, an ordinary man. The kind of person who made his living through long hours, hard work, and simple pleasures. Born in 1925, George had grown up during some of the toughest years in modern Scottish history. Wartime rationing, post-war recovery, and the struggles of the working class. By the time of his death, he lived a quiet, unassuming life in Aberdeen with his wife. Friends and neighbors described him as kind, dependable, and a man who always looked out for others. Driving taxis wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But for George, it paid the bills. His regulars trusted him. He knew the streets like the back of his hand. And at 58, he was still going strong, still working shifts when many others his age were thinking about slowing down. On that September evening in 1983, George set out like he had countless times before. But unlike all the other rides, this one would not end with him dropping a passenger safely at their destination. It would end in blood, silence, and questions that have haunted Scotland for more than 4 decades. The night was Wednesday, September 29th, 1983. George Murdoch had finished up a few fares already and was cruising the streets when, around 8:30 p.m., he picked up a passenger in central Aberdeen. The man asked to be taken toward Coulter, a village just outside the city. It wasn't unusual. Taxi drivers often took late fares out of town. George accepted. He turned his cab westward, headlights cutting through the mist. But George wasn't driving just any passenger. Sitting in the back of his cab was a man whose identity remains a mystery to this day. Witnesses would later describe him as in his mid-20s to early 30s, fair-haired, wearing a brown jacket. Nothing about him stood out. Nothing about him screamed danger. As George drove out of Aberdeen, past the flickering streetlights and into darker stretches of road, he may have thought it was just another routine job. But somewhere along the journey, everything changed. Around 8:45 p.m., George turned his taxi onto Pitfottle Station Road, a quieter, less traveled path. This is where the attack began. What happened next shocked Scotland. Without warning, the man in the back seat leaned forward, pulling a thin wire around George's throat. This was no ordinary wire. It was believed to be a cheese wire, a tool used in kitchens to cut cheese with precise, deadly tension. The garrote was pulled tight, slicing into George's neck. He fought desperately, wrenching at the wire, struggling to breathe. In the chaos, He lost control of the taxi, crashing it against the roadside. George stumbled out, blood running from his wounds, gasping for air. He tried to fight back, but the attacker followed, pulling the wire again, trying to finish the job on the ground. It was an unusually cruel choice of weapon. Why a cheesewire? Was it something the killer had easy access to? Or was there a symbolic reason? Something personal? Two teenage boys cycling nearby witnessed part of the struggle. They later told police they saw George being attacked and tried to raise the alarm. But by the time help arrived, it was too late. George Murdoch lay dying on the roadside, the cheese wire still biting into his skin. The killer fled into the night, leaving behind almost nothing. No clear fingerprints, no obvious trace of DNA, just silence and questions. George was pronounced dead shortly after. His wife, waiting at home, would never see him walk to the door again. And the man who killed him, he was never caught. The murder of George Murdoch was unlike anything Aberdeen had ever seen. A random taxi driver, targeted by a passenger with a brutal, almost theatrical weapon. But the question was why? Was George just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was the killer sending a message, using a wire as a signature? 41 years later, we still don't know. But police are finally closer than ever to answering that question. And in the next part of this story, we'll follow the investigation. From the first chaotic days in 1983 to the decades of silence, and then the DNA breakthrough that has reignited hope. Aberdeen wasn't used to murders like this. The city was industrial, working class, sometimes rough around the edges, but this crime, it was different, cold, calculated, brutal. When the news spread that a taxi driver had been strangled with a cheese wire on a dark roadside, people were horrified. Taxi drivers in particular were terrified. Word spread through ranks and dispatch radios. One of ours has been killed. Watch yourselves. The local papers exploded with headlines. The press and journal ran dramatic front page coverage. Taxi driver murdered, killer still at large. It wasn't just a crime, it was a message, or at least that's how it felt. If someone could climb into a cab and kill a man like George, then no one in Aberdeen's taxi trade was safe. Witnesses were interviewed. The two boys who'd seen part of the attack described a man, blonde or fair-haired, in his mid-20s to early 30s. That was it. No name, no connections. Just a vague description that could have fit thousands of men in Scotland at the time. George's widow was devastated. She made public appeals, begging anyone who knew something come forward. But leads were thin. The killer had vanished into the night without a trace. Detectives canvassed the area around Pitfottle Station Road. They searched ditches, combed through hedgerows, looking for any discarded weapon or personal item the killer might have dropped. But nothing was found. The cheese wire was assumed to be the weapon, but it was gone. The killer had taken it with him. They questioned taxi passengers from that night. They retraced George's known fares earlier in the evening. Still, no break. Several suspects were considered. Men in the area with violent tendencies, or those known to carry wires or unusual tools. But each time, the evidence didn't match. Forensic science in 1983 wasn't what it is today. There was no DNA testing available. Blood typing was crude, and fibers or fingerprints rarely gave definitive answers. Police collected what they could, but the technology to properly analyze It simply didn't exist yet. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The Cheesewire Killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. For George's family, the silence was the worst part. Every year, on the anniversary of his murder, his widow and relatives would renew their appeals. Every year, police would remind the public of the case, hoping someone would come forward. But the years dragged on. Witnesses grew older. Memories faded. Suspects died or disappeared. The nickname Cheesewire Killer became almost folklore in Aberdeen. Taxi drivers swapped stories. Parents warned children. It was a ghost story, but one that was all too real. By the 1990s, the case was officially considered cold. That didn't mean police forgot. It just meant resources were minimal. Every so often, a new detective would take a look. Every so often, a new tip would arrive. But nothing ever cracked it. Imagine being George's family. Decades without answers. Decades of living with the knowledge that the man who killed him might still be out there, living a normal life, raising kids, even becoming a grandfather. And the cruelest thought of all, that he could have been someone they passed on the street. By the early 2000s, forensic science had changed dramatically. DNA profiling was now a powerful tool in cold case investigations. Police in Scotland began reopening old files, testing whatever evidence they had preserved. In George Murdoch's case, detectives had carefully kept samples. Tiny traces from the crime scene, some fibers, some biological material. For years it sat in storage. Now it was tested. The result? A DNA profile, but not a complete match to anyone in the criminal database. This profile was labeled Male Z. That meant whoever this DNA belonged to, they had never been arrested for a crime where DNA was collected. They weren't in the system. But this was still a breakthrough. For the first time, police had something tangible. The case wasn't just a ghost story anymore. It had a genetic fingerprint. Fast forward to 2023. After 40 years, detectives announced they had successfully built a strong, usable DNA profile from evidence in the Cheesewire Killer case. They told the public, "We believe this can help us finally identify George Murdoch's killer." But there was a catch. The DNA didn't match anyone in existing databases. The killer had avoided leaving a criminal trail. So, investigators tried something new: familial DNA searching. This process compares the unknown DNA to people in the system, not for an exact match, but for relatives. Maybe a brother, a cousin, a child. And here's where it gets chilling. The police are now asking the public, ordinary people across Scotland and the UK, to voluntarily provide DNA samples. Because buried in family trees, somewhere might be the connection that reveals Male Z. Think about that for a moment. The Cheesewire Killer could have children or grandchildren alive today. They may have no idea what their father or grandfather did, and yet their DNA could give them away. Audience question: how would you feel if a relative of yours turned out to be the Cheesewire Killer? Would you give your DNA to help solve the case, even if it risked exposing secrets in your own family? For George Murdoch's family, the hope is simple: that after 4 decades of grief, the scientific breakthrough will finally give them the answer they deserve. In recent years, Police Scotland has launched fresh campaigns around the Cheesewire Killer case. They've stood before cameras, held up George Murdoch's photograph, and spoken directly to the public. Someone out there knows who this man is. Someone out there is Male Z or knows Male Z. They've encouraged people to think back. Think about anyone who acted suspicious in 1983. Anyone who came home with unexplained injuries. Anyone who suddenly changed their behavior after September that year. But most importantly, they've asked for something new. Familial DNA donations. That's not a small request. Imagine walking into a police station and voluntarily giving your DNA. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you believe your family tree might hold the answer to a murder. It's a controversial step. Some argue it's invasive. Others say it's the only way forward. And this is where you, the viewer, come in. Audience question. Would you hand over your DNA to help solve a case this old? Or do you believe family secrets, even horrifying ones, should stay buried? With no confirmed suspect in custody, theories have swirled for decades. Who was the Cheesewire Killer? One theory suggests the attack was random violence. A passenger simply snapped, choosing a wire because it was easy to conceal. But if that's true, why didn't the killer ever strike again? At least not in the same way? Another theory points to a personal grudge. Was George targeted? Did he unknowingly cross the wrong man? Some believe the use of a cheese wire was symbolic, meant to humiliate or send a message. But no evidence has ever tied George to anyone who might want him dead. Then there's a serial offender theory. Some criminologists suggest the Cheesewire Killer could have committed other crimes, just not in ways that were linked. Maybe he used different weapons. Maybe he lived a double life, blending into society while carrying a violent streak that only surfaced occasionally. And perhaps the most chilling theory, that the killer lived and maybe still lives right in Aberdeen, that he walked among the very people searching for him, that he was never caught because he was too ordinary to suspect. Audience question. Do you think the Cheesewire Killer was a random madman or someone who knew George personally? Which theory makes the most sense to you? George Murdoch's murder did more than devastate his family. It changed the way people in Scotland thought about safety, trust, and justice. For taxi drivers, it became a defining moment. Many began installing alarms, cameras, and better radios in their vehicles. Taxi unions lobbied for stronger protections. Even today, older drivers in Aberdeen still talk about it. Still remember the fear of that time. For police, it was a lesson in the fragility of justice. They realized how quickly a case could turn cold without hard evidence. And for decades, George's name remained a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. But the legacy is not just fear, it's also hope. The hope that with science, persistence, and public cooperation, even the coldest of cases can one day be solved. It's been 41 years since George Murdoch's final taxi ride. For decades of silence, for decades of grief, but also for decades of waiting for the truth. And now, with DNA evidence in hand, the net is finally closing around Male Z. Here's the unsettling thought. The Cheesewire Killer might not be a ghost from the past. He might be alive today. He might live down the street from you. He might be someone's quiet grandfather, someone who carries the darkest secret imaginable. And when his identity is revealed, it will shatter not just his life, but the lives of everyone who thought they knew him. So I leave you with this question. Could you be related to Male Z and not even know it? If you found this case as haunting as I did, hit the like button so more people see George's story. Subscribe if you want to hear more true crime mysteries, especially ones with shocking new breakthroughs. And let me know in the comments, what do you think happened that night in 1983? Who was the Cheesewire Killer? Click on the video on your screen now to dive into another unsolved mystery, and maybe, just maybe, help bring justice to families still waiting for answers.